Now, tonight, I want to preface this by saying this is not part of Zechariah. And the reason I'm doing this lesson is because a friend of mine, Larry, is one of those fellows who's working with the Israelis, and went back yesterday or the day before. I think he and I were talking while he was in Boston, and he was getting ready to get on a plane head for Jerusalem. And I think today is the first day that he's actually been there. But we've been talking about what was going on, and I was sharing with him. I've been I've been watching the videos, the YouTubes on the red heifer and looking for information regarding that. And I started to get upset because I'm finding a lot of the information on there is not accurate. In fact, it's not even close. In fact, they're showing you pictures that really do not have any part in what they're talking about. So I want to talk tonight about the Para Aduma. I want to talk about the ashes of the red heifer. Now, Larry is a part of that team that's actually, he's responsible, he used to be responsible, excuse me, for feeding the animals and for doing all the livestock prep and care of the animals. But evidently, while he was there before the missiles went off and he was packing up to come back to the United States, he developed a fungus from the food that the animals were eating. And so now he's kind of, I don't want to say he's quarantined. He's watching himself, and he's no longer responsible for feeding the animals. He's only responsible for the maintenance and the care of the animals. So I just wanted to get that out there. Now, he's also over there, and eventually, sometime in the next couple of months, they'll be out again looking for the ashes of the red heifer and looking for articles that belong to the tabernacle. But right now, they're not doing so because the archaeologists themselves actually are part of the army, and they were being used in the field. So there was no one there to run the assignment. So therefore, they've given it up for a couple of months, and now they're going to be starting it up again. Um, right now, the Bureau of Antiquities, which has been up until a year ago, was totally against their finding of anything. In fact, they made it as hard as possible, are now on their side. But then I was looking at another site in which I'm finding out that Bibi Netanyahu is digging tunnels underneath the Temple Mount, attempting to find things down there. So anyway, there's lots of stories going on, and now that the rockets have stopped flying from Iran, things, well, it's time to take stock of some things. Now, we're going to study the one parsha in the Humash. The Humash is the commentary that goes along with just the first 5 books. And in looking at that, there's a portion at the end. It's called Sof Parsha or Sof Sefer. And what it is basically it gives you the number of verses that are found within it and some other particulars. But there was one, if you remember back in December, one that actually goes farther than that, and that's Parsha Maquettes. And it's so different in the sense, well, certainly it does keep track of the 146 verses that are found in that Parsha, but it also did a word count. It's the only Parsha that did that. And it turns out that this Parsha Mikketz has 2,025 words, which I find to be rather interesting. And so as we're working on understanding the Bible, anything that the rabbis put in there is something you need to look at or at least think about. So I've been thinking and I've been constantly pondering that. But I also have to understand that the word Mikketz in Hebrew means at the end or the end of days is another way in which it's put. So we appear to be rapidly approaching the end of this age. So this year, so far, has been quite significant in terms of Israel and the end. Now, we just witnessed the destruction of Iran's war machine. and her nuclear threats. Israel has also destroyed much of the threat from Hamas and will continue to do so because they're unwilling to go to discussions. And by the end of the year, it is anticipated that Hamas will technically be non-existent. Now, Hezbollah to the north is no longer launching missiles because many of them are afraid to be the next person called general or to be in charge. Syria is no longer a threat in that sense, with the removal of Hafez al-Assad and the Ba'ath Party, who have now moved to Russia. Russia is struggling in its own protracted war against Ukraine. But this month, large crowds of Israelis have been doing something that has been unbelievable. They find themselves singing, dancing, and praying on the Temple Mount with no resistance from the Arab community. Now, there have been numerous building projects also going on in Israel, including one called the Ben Gurion Shipping Channel or Shipping Canal. It is going to be done in about a year and a half, and it will be direct competition to the Suez Canal. Now, this canal will be much deeper and much wider than the Suez Canal, which can no longer handle all the shipping, all the cargo vessels. So there'll be a competition for going from the Mediterranean to back into this area where all the oil is being run out of. Now, technically, it's going to go from the Gulf of Aqaba at the port of Eilat, which is the very southern port, which David used to use and Solomon used to use as their southern port for merchant vessels. And it's going to go up through the Negev desert, and it's going to flow through the valley of Arabah. Now, Arabah in the book of Isaiah is the valley that is going to become fertile and wet, and roses will be found. Actually, it'll be water lilies, according to the Hebrew. And the Dead Sea itself will be at one end of the canal. Now, the whole canal will end at the Gaza Strip, just north of it, in the city of Ashdod. So in all, it's going to be about a 160-mile long canal, and it's going to cost them about $100 billion, which they anticipate they will make up in profits from taxing in less than 5 years. But the biggest news in Israel must be the offering of the Parah Adumah, the ashes of the red heifer. I was looking at videos when I ran across a video that was put out on July 8th. It was put out with the idea of, I would show you the video or I'd show you the picture, except it's copywritten. So therefore, I don't want to mess with the copy laws. But I suggest that you can go to YouTube and you can actually see the video itself. It was put out on July 8th. And you will notice that there's no temple anywhere as they're burning. And I use the word burning, not sacrificing, burning a heifer. Actually, the heifer that they were burning was Sagila. Sagila was one of the 5 heifers that they brought over from Texas. Sagila happened to be disqualified because of warts that started growing on her neck and shoulder. So she was no longer acceptable. So they used her as practice. Now, today, there's so many of us that wonder how close we are to the Mikketz Hayomin, the end of days, that we understand that there's so much action contributing to this thinking. Well, I don't know how many of you actually have seen the video, but it's put out by Charisma Media. And so I wanted to make you aware of it. Now, most people will see whatever they can from using the Bible and using the book of Numbers 19, which actually literally talks about this. And then there's also Ezekiel in chapter 36. Both of them will give you instructions. Understand that the Instructions for the red heifer are called hoch. In other words, they are laws that really, they're undescribable. In other words, you don't necessarily know why you're doing it or what's happening as you're doing it. It's just part of the process. Now, these statutes are permanent. They're binding. In other words, once they begin this process, it'll be part of the program. And so they meet a moral and a religious need that the Jewish people have. Now, in ancient Israel, statutes and decrees were central to the covenant relationship between God and his people. And the Torah was partially given to Moses on Mount Sinai. While it is said God began to share some of these things, many of the 613, before they got there. In fact, according to some writings, it was at Marah, just after they crossed out of Egypt and into the land, that they actually found that they were given the orders on the red heifer. And so the red heifer would eventually be found and would be used. Now, this is, again, these are hokim, they're religious practices. They're about social justice. They're about community life. So they're automatically included. And oftentimes you just don't understand why until it comes to the end. In fact, the red heifer was said to be the one thing that Solomon was unable to understand. Now, I want to look at the words of Moses and the prophet Ezekiel. Perhaps we would do well to define the concept of prophecy according to the authentic Jewish tradition. Prophetic revelation is the closest brush that we can have with the divine. Now, in certain prophetic experiences, a man becomes the instrument through which God exerts his power. Now, this is like becoming a channel for the divine message. But understand, we don't have this ability today. It was only available basically up through the first temple period and a little bit after. God only grants the gift of prophecy for the sake of his people, and it's an experience which requires tremendous effort and preparation. Back in the Old Testament, schools were created. Elijah himself had 3 different schools that he had started for the prophets. You can find that in 2 Kings 2. Now, one of the highest levels of sanctification, it can only be attained, according to the Jews, in the Holy Land itself. Now, there was one exception. That was Ezekiel. He was the only prophet who received his gift by the river Habar in Babylon. Now, no one today can obviously experience true prophecy. It's something that ended with Malachi. But there's levels of divine guidance and inspiration which God bestows upon those who are deserving. We have the right, we have need to learn as much of the Bible as we possibly can and to get into understanding as much of the Bible as we can. That's why I found some of the videos that I was watching a waste of time, and basically we're leading people in the wrong direction. So I want to try tonight to clarify some of the things that I was actually seeing and help you to understand. People really do not know what's going on. Bottom line. Now, even though many, many people were granted the gift of prophecy back then, the Torah only records in the whole Bible 55 people actually had the gift of prophecy. Those prophecies which have come to us through the scriptures, they're obviously timeless, but they came from very few people. Originally, there were much more. In fact, prophecy was very, very common. But the ones that are found in our scriptures wrote not just for a person, but they wrote for nations or communities, and therefore they're included. There was a writing on May 10th, 2025 by, Rabbi Azari Ariel. who was part of the Temple Institute. Now, he was talking about the project, the red heifer. And in his comments, he said, at this moment, it is unclear whether we have in our possession in Israel a red heifer that is verifiably kosher and suited for the ceremony. Now, this announcement seems significant, but it wasn't right. It indicates that if they don't have it now, it's going to be a long time coming. But at the same point in time, they do have two heifers that are qualified. Now, the question is, where do they sacrifice it and when do they sacrifice them? Timing is most important. Larry, who is my friend who works with the animals, also is working on the dig. He's hoping, as I'm hoping, that before they decide to sacrifice the animal, that they will actually be able to find the ashes, the kalel, the bowl of ashes of the first nine red heifers. You see, each one began from the other one. And let me stop and do a bird walk. Bird walking means for me is I'm going to go outside of my ideas or my script and tell you something that I see is important, but I forgot to write it down. In our story, one of the things that we have to understand is there were 9, according to Rambam, that had been used all the way from the time of Moses all the way to just after the second temple was destroyed. In other words, they had enough ashes to continue the process. Now, in each case, as they were running out of the ashes, another heifer was found. They would take the heifer, they would offer it to God. They don't sacrifice these heifers, they offer them. These heifers are not cut into pieces, they're not filleted. They are the animal itself. The whole animal is laid on the altar, perfectly normal, just like Isaac was laid on the altar when Abraham was about to sacrifice him. Now, as the animal has been mercifully killed by the shochet, by the ritual slaughterer, as he's laying there, they will take the dung out of the heifer, and they will use it to help, along with dirt from around the altar itself. And I'll have to explain to you the altar in a little bit. They'll take those two and they begin to water it and mold it. That becomes the new kalel. Then the ashes from the most recent one will be added to those ashes so that they begin. It's a continual process. That's why I'm hoping, well, I guess I shouldn't hope, it's God's decision on how it gets done. But this is my understanding from Vendel and from others who have gone through this process of what's going on. So anyway, I'm not certain. I kind of lost my place. There are still 2 heifers left. They originally came from Texas. Now, to get from Texas to the Israel required that they had to get on an airplane. The only problem is the United States doesn't allow cows to fly. They don't even allow pigs to fly. But anyway, back to the story. They don't allow the cows to fly. So Israel had to come up with something very unique. So when it came time to be transported, they were identified as pets. And because they were pets, they were able to be taken by their owner or owners, 5 of them, and brought to, it turns out, to Shiloh. And that's an important spot. They were brought to Shiloh, not to Jerusalem, not to Gilgal, not to anywhere else. They were brought to Shiloh. If you've got a Bible, I want you to open your Bible and I want to look at Genesis chapter 49. We're going to look at a set of scriptures which is very puzzling. And I want to try to give you some understanding, deeper understanding of what those words are telling us. So if you're in chapter 49 of the book of Genesis, we're going to look at the character and the prophecy over Judah. And I want you to start in verse number 10. Now, you probably have heard this multiple times before. It says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a scholar from among his descendants until Shiloh arrives. Now, when it says Shiloh arrives, that doesn't mean that they're looking for Shiloh to come to them. They're arriving at Shiloh. My wife used to bring the train down from Michigan in order to get to school. That's not how I used to think of it, but that's how they phrase it. And so in our understanding then, when they're talking about this idea of descendants and until Shiloh arrives, we're really talking about the fact that the people will arrive at Shiloh. Now, Shiloh is not in the area of Jerusalem. In fact, Shiloh was well, it's not the first place, but it was one of the places Eli and Samuel were at Shiloh. Those are the stories that you have there. Now, in a reading of this whole thing, you have to understand that Shiloh at that time, at the time of this writing in Genesis, was nothing. It was a small community. It was a community that would later be occupied by the Jews because it would be given to the Jews. But at the time of this writing, it was simply a place. But so it comes that they're starting there. And he will be an assemblage of nations, and his will be an assembly of nations. So the character that they're looking for is the Mashiach, the Messiah, who will come to Shiloh. Why would he come to Shiloh? He will tie his donkey, his hamor. Now understand, a hamor is an unkosher animal. It is not kosher at all. So therefore, the Messiah is going to tie his donkey, his unkosher animal, and at the same time to a vine, to the vine branch, his donkey's foal, and he will launder his garments in wine and his robe in the blood of grapes. Shiloh, up until 1970, didn't have a vine in it. There was no grape vineyards. Vineyards became something that happened much later after the 48 war. And by 1970, there were no vines at all in Shiloh. So we now have a situation where we're now talking about an unkosher animal that the Messiah is bringing, and he is bringing it along with its colt, and he's tying it to a vine. Now, while he's doing that, he dismounts and he washes or launders, however you want to put it, his garments in wine and his robe in the blood of the grapes, red-eyed from wine and white-toothed from milk. So we now have this adventure going on where we're not looking at Jerusalem, where we know that is where the Messiah will end up, but we're at a place that is far different than that. 6 years ago, they decided that they were going to create a position called a shochet. A shochet is a ritual slaughterer. He's the one responsible for making sure that the animal, when it is killed in such a way that there's no pain. So they set up a altar, and I use the word altar incorrectly, but I'm using it here. He would load the animal on the altar, and at that point in time, they would burn the entire animal. That part I want you to understand. Now, the donkey, in a deeper level, the word for donkey is hamor, which shares its meaning with homer, which is to be matter or physical substance. So the donkey was therefore a symbol of the physical world. It's about the body. It's about the mundane life, all which is impure, but can be elevated, because you understand we're supposed to be about the process of elevating the world that we're living in. Now, tying the donkey to the vine hints of binding a physical object to a spiritual one. Now, in Zechariah 9:9, the Messiah arrives lowly and riding on a donkey. And we've heard that story many times in a Christian church, but that's not what they're talking about. The donkey now becomes a messianic symbol of humility, of redemption, because it's redemption through nonviolence. It's the transformation of the physical. The donkey may represent the materialistic world, the world of Esau, the world of Edom, the world of Rome, which ultimately will be subjected or subjugated and refined by Judah and the Messiah. So tying the donkey to the vine hints that one's master is going to be the master over Esau, the master over the body. So the donkey was common in Egypt, and it's symbolic of slavery and burdens. Another thing that we should understand. So the Mashiach descended from Judah will break the bonds of servitude. That's what the donkey is supposed to represent for us. So the donkey, as a non-kosher animal, has a specific and exceptional interest in the halakha. In Exodus 13:13, the firstborn of a donkey needed to be redeemed. Well, how do you redeem a donkey? You use a lamb. Why might you ask? Well, the donkey is the only non-kosher animal with a mitzvah. So in the Zohar and in the Bo 2:40b, the donkey is said to represent the husk, the klipa, the external shell, and it must be redeemed, not destroyed. That's why the next animal, and if I'm correct, and Larry said that he's recommended it, what we're going to see is that the animal that they're going to use, her name is Gilah, which means redemption. So redemption will happen when this animal is slaughtered on the altar correctly. Now, the fact that the donkey requires redemption hints at the hidden holiness. It contains sparks that can be elevated. So in Kabbalah, the donkey can represent the body that carries the soul. We've talked about this, and in fact, they were talking about it before we came on tonight. The idea of the fact that the body and the soul never gets disease. That's only for the body. But the messianic donkey will be a perfect body, a vessel that once blocked the light now is going to submit and carry God's divine will. The Messiah doesn't destroy the donkey. He rides it. He evaluates it. As I mentioned it earlier in Genesis 49:11, that the part of Jacob's blessing to Judah, who's the ancestor of David and the messianic line, Judah is the one who confronts his past. In fact, he's the only one of the brothers who does so. He owns his own mistakes. And remember the whole story of Tamar. Remember, he refused to give his third son to Tamar, and God created a situation where Tamar and Judah became one. So he is the one who can evaluate the impure, even the non-kosher donkey, binding it to the vine. And in this case, the vine is called the tree of life, or the Torah. So the donkey here is not just a contradiction, it's a deliberate spiritual message. Even that which is unclean, that's material or lowly, can become the vehicle for redemption when bound to holiness. You are never, never too low to be saved. Redemption is available to all of us. Now, if what I have shared to this point is true, The heifer does not have to be offered on a Mount of Olives facing the future temple that isn't there yet. In fact, it is more likely that it'll be killed at Shiloh. So right now, as I speak, there's a dig going on at Shiloh looking for the tabernacle gate. Would it be appropriate to sacrifice the 10th heifer just outside the location of the tabernacle that is found where Eli and Samuel were prophets? Now, this week I took some time to study what, again, where, how, and it's a process that I hopefully have been able to master a little bit. Now, this animal was not being sacrificed. Instead, it was being offered. In a sacrifice, there's nothing that is, well, you can share it, some of them. An offering is straight to God. Now, there are stringent biblical requirements for the red heifer, and they're found in Numbers 19. You know, it's a cow, a female cow, and at minimum, it has to be in its 3rd year. It needs to be completely red. Now, when we say red, the word here is actually reddish. In fact, the word is adamah. So it's the red color of the soil. Now, if it has even 2 hairs of a different color that are next to each other, or 3 that are very, very close, it's automatically disqualified. All physical blemishes that disqualify sacrificial animals also disqualify this red heifer. Any work done by this cow, it disqualifies it. It cannot even carry a blanket. No yoke ever be upon it. Now, if the heifer is pregnant or a male has mated with it, it again is disqualified. Now, in writing this story, I have insisted on referring to this not as a sacrifice, but as an offering. Please hold that word in your mind, offering. It doesn't fit neatly into the parameters of a sacrifice. So, in a nutshell, the Torah tells us that one who comes into contact with a corpse by touching or even being under the same roof as the corpse becomes impure. And as a result, that person cannot enter the tabernacle or the holy temple or participate in the sacrificial offerings or other sacred foods that, well, would help to purify them. Now, as part of the purification process, the priest would slaughter the red heifer, burn it on a what I would call a pyre, together with cedar branches, with hyssop sprigs, and with crimson wool. Now, this is all found in the Midrash. Now, they would then take the ashes, mix them with spring water, and sprinkle the mixture on that impure person. Now, in offering of the Parah Adumah, the altar or platform used is not the same as what we call the Mizbach, which is the altar of a temple. It's not stone, it's wooden. It's about 6 cubits long, 6 cubits wide, and 6 cubits high. Now, the height is going to stress you out because, first off, 4 cubits of the 6 are going to be buried into the ground. Only 2 cubits will be above the surface of the earth. The reason they do that is to try to eliminate the blowing of the breezes so that most of the ashes would stay right there. So this is according to Parah 3:7. Now, there are other rabbinic sources that suggest the same thing, but understand that that's the main source that Rambam created. Now, the Mizbach altar for the Parah Odamah can't be made of stone, and it's rather for an offering, and it's always on the wooden pyre. Now, the focus is on burning the entire animal in a ritual manner, and it's burned along with cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson. But understand that there's more to it than just that. Now, we have a lack of a stone, which leads to the name Para Aduma. Para is the animal, the Aduma is the soil, the earth. So it's the atonement for the stratagem or for the sacrifice for the purposes of purifying that which is impure. So we're operating not in the temple, not even on the temple grounds. It is a ritual that is done away from the community. The first one was done away from the community. There was no place at that point in time when the first one was killed. Now, the use of wood is necessary because it's about natural. It's about that which is perishable, rather than the idea of, well, think of it this way. There's a hidden message in this understanding. Why must it be pure red? And actually, that would be Adama, the color. The earth, again, originally had no weeds. It was no black, there's no white. It was just the earth. Now, this animal cannot have black hair or white hair, and it can't have warts, which is what caused Zigila to be used. It needed to be a female, and that's the interesting thing. Why did it have to be a female and not a male? Because it's hiding something. We need to understand that the Jews are in a state that is known as Tumat Met, the most severe form of ritual impurity. We all are. They have been in this spiritual state since the destruction of the Second Temple and the last use of the ashes. Now, during temple times, ritual purity was of utmost importance. There were various ways of becoming ritually pure, again, such as bathing, or rather immersing oneself in the mikveh that contained a prescribed amount of water. Now, the most complete ritual for purification involved the mixing of the ashes with the water. Cedar wood, hyssop, wool, dyed scarlet would be added to the fire. The altar that they were using on the 8th was actually made out of a willow, not out of cedar. Cedar was used as a part. Willow, understand, has no fragrance, has no fruit. There's nothing significant in it. That's why the willow was used. So in order to purify a person who has been richly contaminated by contact with the corpse, the water plus the vessel that's sprinkled on them, plus the hyssop, and it's on the 3rd and the 7th day that this process goes on. Now, the priest who performs the ritual then becomes ritually unclean and must then bathe himself in his clothes in the mikveh. He is deemed to be impure until evening. Now, the question is, what does impure mean? Well, the key to understanding the mystical background in the laws of purity and impurity is to analyze those two words. To understand the word impure is the word tameh, which is made out of 3 letters, tet, mem, aleph. To be pure, we have the word tahor, which is made from 4 letters, tov, he, vav, and resh, which you can't remember, but just to give you an understanding. A person who is impure is now blocked from receiving spiritual light. That's why he is found to be tameh. He can't receive the light. Now, for the letters of pure, the pure can contain 2 letters that speak to light. Tahor has the vav and the het, hey, that makes it the word or, which is the word for pure. Now, from this, I want to try to draw a conclusion that a person who is impure is somehow blocked from receiving spiritual light. Isn't that what we used to think when we were as Christians? We talked about sin. It's blocking us. Well, in fact, the sages who lived in the age of the Holy Ari, who lived in Safat, predicted that to reach the spiritual level of Ari or Abraham or any of those others, one must have had access to the ashes of the Para Adumah. This statement implies that a person who has been purified by the ashes of the red cow can obtain higher spiritual and intellectual levels that you cannot reach in any other way. Now, there was a book written called Faith and Folly. Rabbi Yitzhak Halil, on page 45 in his book, wrote this. Now I got to find it. Why can't I find it? Here it is. It was no longer possible to enter into Pardes, enter into the orchard. We call it paradise. That is a higher spiritual worlds like Yetzirah, Beriah, or Atzilut. And I guess there was one more thing that I haven't told you. Why does it have to be a female and not a male? Because only the female can hide the essence of the male, and it does so for 9 months. We can see that it can conceal or it can receive, and the end of that, a new reality. So ever since creation, that has been hidden either by God's design or by man's stupidity, but that the hidden knowledge in the end will be revealed. I want to close with this. Understand that everything really started happening on October 7th, 2023. You see, when Hamas began to expose anti-Semitism, not just in Gaza, but across the world, we began to notice anti-Torah was being revealed everywhere. Also remember that on October 7th, the Jews ended, if you go back to my tapes, my recordings on Daniel chapter 12, you'll find that I put down the 70 weeks that they talk about were actually Jubilee seasons. And we reached the end on October 7th. From then on, we're now living in an age that is not covered in the Bible. We're outside of that. So now in 2025, this hate that has begun is really separating us, making believers and non-believers go in opposite directions. The Messiah must be coming soon because it will not be hard for him to figure out who's who. Okay, I've talked for 47 minutes. I guess that's enough. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.